There are mistakes that change everything. Not the small ones, the wrong turn on a familiar road, the forgotten name, the misread hour. The ones that matter are the ones that drop you into a life you were not expecting, into a room you were not meant to enter, in front of a person you were not supposed to meet. Lyra had made exactly one mistake in 23 years of being very careful. She had counted the windows wrong. That was all. 3 windows from the east tower, her cousin Petra had said, "Third floor, the latch is broken. Climb in and wait. I'll come for you before the ceremony begins, and we'll get you out through the servants' corridor before Lord Vane even knows you're gone." Petra had drawn her a map on a scrap of paper. Lyra had memorized it. She had been careful. She was always careful. She had counted 3 windows from the east tower, 3rd floor, stone ledge wide enough for footing, broken latch, exactly as described. She had not accounted for the fact that she had counted from the wrong tower, that there were 2 east-facing towers in the Palace of Velmore, and she had chosen the wrong one. She understood this approximately 2 seconds after she pushed the window open, swung her legs over the sill, dropped into the room, and looked up to find that it was not a dusty, unused guest chamber with a narrow servant's door. It was a private study lit by a low fire and 3 candelabras, lined floor to ceiling with maps and books and the particular ordered chaos of a room that was genuinely used and used constantly. And standing at the desk in the center of it, utterly still, was the largest man she had ever seen in her life. He was looking at her with pale silver eyes that gave away nothing at all. Neither of them moved. Lyra became aware, in the specific heightened way of someone whose heart has just attempted to exit their chest, of several things simultaneously, that she was standing in a stranger's private study at 11 at night, having climbed through his window in a formal ball gown. That the stranger in question was not a stranger to anyone in the 4 wolf territories. Because you did not reach the age of 23 in a noble wolf family without knowing exactly what the Alpha King of Velmore looked like. That the bond, the mate bond she had heard described her entire life and had never felt, had just snapped into place in her chest like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. She said the only thing her mind produced. "I have the wrong window." The Alpha King looked at her for a long moment. Then, he said, "It would appear so." Neither of them understood yet what the wrong window was actually the beginning of. His name was Calum Vex. She knew that the way everyone in the 4 territories knew it, the way you knew the name of a storm that had been named before it reached you. Alpha King of Velmore, ruler of the largest wolf territory on the continent, unmated at 31, which the noble houses had been speculating about for years. Powerful in the specific absolute way of bloodlines so old and undiluted they were more legend than wolf. She knew all of that. What she had not known, what no political briefing or noble gossip had prepared her for, was that he would be standing in his private study at 11 at night, in plain dark clothing with his silver blonde hair slightly disordered, as if he had been running his hands through it, surrounded by maps covered in his own handwriting, looking at her as if she were a problem he had not budgeted time for, but intended to solve completely. He said, "You're going to tell me what you're doing climbing palace windows in formal attire." It was not a question. She said, "I was trying to reach a guest chamber 3 floors up in the east tower." He looked at her. He said, "This is the west tower." She closed her eyes briefly. She opened them. She said, "I see that now." He said, "Who are you?" She said, "Lyra Ashvane." Something shifted in his expression. Not recognition exactly. Recalibration. She knew what it meant. The Ashvane name was not obscure. Her father was Lord Brennan Ashvane, mid-rank noble of the Southern Wolf Territory, which meant she was exactly the kind of person who would be at a formal palace gathering, and exactly the kind of person who had no business in the Alpha King's private study. He said, "Lord Brennan's daughter." She said, "Yes," he said, "who is being presented to Lord Vane tonight." It was not a question either. She said, "Yes," he said, "and you are climbing windows to avoid that presentation." She looked at him steadily. She said, I am climbing windows to avoid being formally handed to a man twice my age who has buried 2 previous mates under circumstances his pack won't discuss openly. Yes, Calum Vex looked at her for a long moment. He said, That's a significant accusation. She said, I know. He said, Do you have evidence? She said, 3 she-wolves in 4 years. The first died of a sudden illness 6 months after the mating. The second fell from a balcony 14 months in. The third simply stopped being mentioned in any official communication 18 months ago, and Lord Vane has not addressed it directly when asked. She said, I've been compiling it for 2 months since my father announced the arrangement. He studied her. She had the sensation of being read very thoroughly and quickly. The way maps are read, the way terrain is assessed before a decision is made. He said, Sit down. She said, I should go. He said, In a moment. Sit down. She sat, not because he was the Alpha King and she had no choice, although both of those things were true. Because the bond that had snapped into place the moment she dropped through his window was doing something to her nervous system that made standing feel unreliable. She sat in the chair across from his desk and folded her hands in her lap and tried to look like a woman who regularly climbed into the Alpha King's private study at 11 at night. He moved to the other side of the desk. He did not sit. He stood and looked at his maps for a moment, as if recalibrating something. She looked at him in profile and thought about the bond. She had felt it, fully and unmistakably, the moment she had looked up and found his silver eyes on her. She did not know if he had felt it. She did not know what she would do with the information either way. He said, Tell me about the evidence. She told him she had been thorough, 2 months of quiet research, carefully worded letters to contacts in Lord Vane's territory, conversations with traders who passed through, a particular account from a healer woman who had attended the second mate in her final weeks that Lyra had obtained through 3 layers of careful introduction. She laid it out plainly. He listened the way she was already beginning to recognize as particular to him, complete attention, no interruption, no expression that revealed where his assessment was landing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Why didn't you take this to your father? She said, My father arranged this match to secure a trade alliance. He doesn't want evidence. He wants a signed contract. He said, To a lord you believe to be dangerous. She said, Yes, he said, and your solution was to climb out a window. She said, My solution was to escape the ceremony tonight and travel to my mother's sister in the Northern Territory and present my evidence to the Northern Council from there, where my father's influence doesn't reach. The window was step 1. He looked at her. Something had changed in his expression, and she couldn't name it yet. He said, That's either very brave or very foolish. She said, Most things worth doing are both. He was quiet again. The fire had settled lower, and the room had gone warmer and closer, and she was very aware of the bond sitting in her chest like a struck bell still ringing. She said, I should go. I've taken up enough of your evening. He said, Lord Vane is currently in the main hall, between you and the East Tower. She said, I know the layout of the palace reasonably well. He said, He brought 4 of his own guard. She went still. He said, They've been positioned at the corridor junctions since the gathering began. I noticed and found it unusual. I'm finding it less unusual now. She looked at him. He said, It appears your assessment of Lord Vane's character may be accurate. She said, It is accurate. He said, Then you have a problem. She said, I've had the problem for 2 months. He said, You have a more immediate version of it now. She said, Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, There is a second door in this study. It leads to a private corridor that connects to the East Tower without passing the main hall junctions. She said nothing. He said, I can show you where it goes. She said, Why would you do that? He said, Because 3 she-wolves in 4 years is not a coincidence, and I have been looking for a reason to look more closely at Lord Vane's territory for 6 months. He said, "Your evidence gives me that reason." He said it cleanly, pragmatically. She heard what was underneath it and chose not to name it yet. She said, "All right." He crossed to the far wall and pressed a panel she would never have found herself. A door opened onto a dark, narrow corridor. He picked up a candle. He said, "Stay close." The corridor was narrow and cold and smelled of old stone. He walked ahead of her with the candle, and she followed close enough to stay in the light. She was very aware of the bond with every step, the way it pulled her toward him with the quiet insistence of something that had always been true and was only now being acknowledged. She did not say anything about it. She did not know enough about him yet to know what saying it would cost. The corridor branched twice. He took the turns without hesitation, which meant he knew this passage well, which meant he used it, which meant there were things the Alpha King of Velmore moved through his own palace without announcing, and she filed that away as information worth knowing. They came out through a panel in a storage room on the 2nd floor of the East Tower. He held the candle up. She looked around and recognized the corridor Petra had described. "Third door on the left," she said quietly. He said, "Your cousin is waiting there?" She said yes. She turned to him in the narrow corridor and looked up at him and said, "Thank you." He looked down at her. The candle threw warm gold light across his face, and she saw something in his expression that was not the careful, controlled assessment of the study. Something that had not been there when she first dropped through his window, or perhaps had been there and she had been too overwhelmed to read it. He said, "The evidence you compiled. I want a copy." She said, "I'll send it tomorrow." He said, "Do that." She said, "And then?" He said, "And then I'll begin my own investigation through official channels." He said, "Lord Vane will not be permitted to take a mate while that investigation is open." Something loosened in her chest. Not fully, but enough. She said, "He'll know it was me." He said, "He'll suspect. He won't be certain. And he will have the Alpha King's investigation between him and you." She looked at him. She said, "Why?" He said, "I told you. 3 she-wolves." She said, "That's not all of it." He held her gaze. He said no. She waited. He said, "You know it isn't." She said, "I felt it when I came through the window." He said, "Yes," she said. "Did you?" The question sat between them in the cold, narrow corridor. He said, "Yes," she exhaled. She said, "What does that mean for the investigation?" He said, "Nothing. It means nothing for the investigation. The investigation will be conducted because it should be conducted regardless of anything else." She said, "And the bond," he said, "is something we'll discuss when you're not in a palace corridor at midnight with Lord Vane's guards at the junctions." She said, "That's reasonable." He said, "Go to your cousin." She said, "All right." She turned toward the door. She stopped. She said, "Calum." He went still at the name. She had not asked permission to use it. She said, "I counted the windows wrong because I was nervous. I am not usually nervous." He said nothing. She said, "I want you to know that because I think it's going to matter later that you know I'm usually steadier than tonight suggested." Something moved through his expression that she thought might have been the beginning of something it wasn't time for yet. He said, "I'll keep that in mind." She went to the 3rd door on the left and knocked twice. Petra opened it in approximately 1 second, grabbed her arm, pulled her inside, and said in a furious whisper, "Where have you been? I have been here for 40 minutes, and Lord Vane has been asking after you in the main hall, and your father is starting to look for you." Lyra said, "I counted the wrong windows." Petra stared at her. She said, "You what?" Lyra said, "It doesn't matter. We need to talk about the plan for tonight, but first I need paper and something to write with." Petra said, "Why?" Lyra said, "I need to send something to the Alpha King before morning." Petra went completely still. She said, "Lyra." Lyra was already looking for paper. She said, "I'll explain everything." Petra said, You climbed into the Alpha King's window, Lyra said. The wrong window, yes. Petra sat down on the edge of the bed. She said, in a voice that had gone entirely flat, "Tell me everything right now." Lyra found paper. She sat across from her cousin and told her. Not everything. Not the bond, not yet. That was something she was still sitting with in the part of herself that needed quiet to process the important things. But the corridor, the evidence, the agreement, Lord Vane's guards at the junctions. Petra listened with the focused expression of a woman rapidly updating her understanding of the night's events. When Lyra finished, Petra said, "So the Alpha King is going to investigate Lord Vane." Lyra said, "Yes." Petra said, "Because of your evidence." Lyra said, "And because he had already been watching the territory for reasons of his own." Petra said, "And you're just going to leave in the morning as planned and send him a copy of your evidence by rider, and that's it." Lyra said, "Yes." Petra looked at her for a long moment. She said, "You're not telling me everything." Lyra said, "I'm telling you what matters tonight." Petra said, Lyra looked at her cousin, the one person in her life who had helped her compile evidence for 2 months and drawn her a map on a scrap of paper and waited 40 minutes in a cold room. She said, "I felt the bond." Petra was silent for a long count. She said, "With him." Lyra said, "Yes." Petra said, "The Alpha King." Lyra said, "Yes." Petra said nothing for another long moment. Then she said, "You counted the wrong windows." Lyra said, "Yes." Petra said, "And ended up in the fated mate bond with the Alpha King of Velmore." Lyra said, "It would appear so." Petra looked at the ceiling. She said, "Only you." She said it with something that was not quite exasperation and not quite awe, and was entirely both. She left the palace before dawn, not secretly, not the way she had planned, through servants' corridors and borrowed horses and the particular desperate haste of a woman running from an arranged mating. She left through the main gate with Petra beside her, and a letter of safe passage bearing the Alpha King's seal, which had appeared under the guest chamber door at some point in the night, slipped through without a knock, without a note, just the sealed letter and the particular message of the seal itself. Lord Vane's guards had been removed from the corridor junctions. She did not know how or when. She chose not to ask. She rode north with Petra through the early gray morning, and she did not look back at the palace of Velmore, because she had learned early that looking back when you were trying to move forward was a habit that cost more than it gave. She thought instead about what was ahead. Her mother's sister, Aunt Cressida, lived in the Northern Territory in a house that had always felt like the only place in the world where Lyra could think without someone else's agenda in the room. She had been planning this journey for 2 months, the evidence in her saddlebag, the route memorized, the contacts arranged. She had planned it as an escape. It felt different now, less like running from something and more like moving toward a position from which she could act. The evidence was real. The investigation would happen. And somewhere behind her in the palace of Velmore, a man with pale silver eyes and disordered silver blonde hair was already looking at maps and making decisions, and she was connected to him by something that had no political category and no neat resolution, and felt like the most honest thing that had happened to her in years. She thought about that bond with the careful analytical attention she gave to everything that mattered. She had been told her whole life what the mate bond was. Sacred, instinctive, the moon's own design, the union that strengthened pack and bloodline and territory. She had heard it described romantically by women who had found their mates young and easily, and had never had reason to interrogate what the bond actually meant beyond the feeling of it. She had heard it described pragmatically by her father, who had mated for alliance and called the bond a useful confirmation of a good arrangement. She had never heard it described by someone who had found it at the wrong time in the wrong room, under circumstances that complicated everything. She was going to have to develop her own description. They reached the northern border of the Velmore territory by midday, and crossed into the neutral lands between territories by late afternoon. Petra, who had been riding in thoughtful silence for most of the journey, said, "What does he know about you?" Lyra thought about the study, the fire and the maps and his voice saying sit down, and the way he had listened to her evidence with complete attention. She said, "That I'm Brennan Ashvane's daughter and that I've been researching Lord Vane for 2 months, and that I counted the wrong windows." Petra said, "And the bond?" Lyra said, "He knows I felt it." Petra said, "Does he know you're not going to just disappear into the Northern Territory and pretend it didn't happen?" Lyra said, "He's intelligent. He'll have worked that out." Petra said, "Will he act on it?" Lyra was quiet for a moment. She thought about the corridor, the candle, the particular quality of his voice when she had said his name without asking permission and he had gone still. She said, "Not until he's ready." She said, "He'll do the investigation first. He'll do it properly and completely, because that's how he does things. And then he'll decide what to do about the rest of it." Petra said, "What if he decides to do nothing about the rest of it?" Lyra said, "Then I'll have the information I need." Petra said, "What information?" Lyra said, "That he's someone who feels a mate bond and decides it's inconvenient." She said, "I'd rather know that early." Petra looked at her. She said, "You're very calm about this." Lyra said, "I've been calm about difficult things my whole life." Petra said, "This is different from difficult things." Lyra said, "I know." She said, "That's why I'm being careful with the calm." They arrived at Aunt Cressida's house as the sun was setting, the northern sky going purple and gold above the stone house that sat at the edge of the forest like it had grown there. Cressida met them at the gate. She was a tall, angular woman in her 60s with Lyra's mother's eyes and a manner that had always reminded Lyra of a very intelligent bird, quick and still by turns, missing nothing. She looked at Lyra, and then at Petra, and then at the saddlebag Lyra was carrying with the particular care of someone transporting something important. She said, "Come inside. Tell me everything." They sat at her kitchen table with tea and the fire going, and Lyra told her. The evidence, the arrangement, the window, the study. Cressida listened in complete silence. When Lyra finished, Cressida said, "The Alpha King gave you safe passage." Lyra said, "Yes." Cressida said, "And agreed to investigate Vane." Lyra said, "Yes," Cressida said, "because of the evidence or because of the bond." Lyra said both. Cressida looked at her for a long moment. She said, "Your father is going to be extremely difficult about this." Lyra said yes. Cressida said, "He arranged the Vane match for the southern trade route access. He won't simply accept the investigation as reason enough to dissolve it. He'll say the Alpha King is overreaching. He'll make it political." Lyra said, "I know." Cressida said, "So what are you going to do?" Lyra wrapped her hands around her cup. She said, "I'm going to present the evidence to the Northern Council formally tomorrow. I'm going to make the record official and public enough that my father can't quietly bury it. And then I'm going to wait and see what Calum Vex does next." Cressida raised an eyebrow at the name. Lyra said, "Don't." Cressida said, "I didn't say anything." Lyra said, "You were going to." Cressida said, "I was going to say that in 30 years of watching this territory, I have never heard anyone refer to the Alpha King of Velmore by his given name in casual conversation." She said, "It's interesting." Lyra said, "It's nothing yet." Cressida looked at her with the quick, still quality that missed nothing. She said, "No, but it's going to be something." Lyra said, "Maybe," she said. First things first, the Northern Council received her evidence on the second morning. 7 senior wolves seated around a long table in the council hall, Cressida among them by right of her position as Northern Territory elder, the others ranging from openly skeptical to carefully neutral when Lyra walked in with her saddlebag and her composed face and her 2 months of work. She laid it out the same way she had laid it out in the private study 2 nights ago. Plainly, sequentially, without embellishment, the 3 mates, the timelines, the healer woman's account, the pattern of silence in Lord Vane's territory when the question was raised, the specific way that silence had a shape that ordinary grief did not. The council listened, asked questions. She answered them. The skeptical ones pushed on the healer's account, and she produced her written record of that conversation and let them read it. The neutral ones asked about the Alpha King's investigation, and she produced the safe passage letter with its seal and let that speak for itself. By the end of the second hour, the council had voted to formally receive the evidence into the Northern Record, which meant it existed now in a place her father could not reach. Which meant that whatever happened next, the record was real. She walked out of the council hall into the cold northern morning and stood in the courtyard for a moment and let herself feel it. The relief of something done. She had been carrying the evidence for 2 months with the specific tension of a person holding something important that might be taken from them at any moment. It was no longer only hers to hold. She rode back to Cressida's house and found a letter waiting. It had arrived by fast rider that morning, Cressida said, with a second rider waiting for a response. The seal was the Alpha King's. She took it to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The letter was not long. It said that his investigators had begun work in Lord Vane's territory as of that morning. It said that Lord Vane had been formally notified that no mating arrangements involving his household would be recognized by the Crown until the investigation concluded. It said, in language that was direct without being personal, that the Ashvane arrangement was therefore suspended indefinitely, and that Lord Brennan Ashvane had been so informed through official channels. It said that she would be kept informed of significant developments. It was signed with his full title. She read it 3 times. She thought about the difference between a letter signed with a title and a letter that was not. She thought about the private study and the candle and the corridor. She wrote back. Her letter was also not long. She confirmed that the evidence had been formally received by the Northern Council and was now in the official record. She said she was grateful for the speed of the investigation. She said one more thing. She wrote, "You signed your letter with your title. In our corridor you were Calum. I would prefer to keep the distinction." She sent it with the waiting rider. Then she went downstairs and helped Cressida prepare dinner and did not think about what he would do with that last line. She almost convinced herself. His reply came the following morning. It was 3 lines. It said the investigation was proceeding and he would have more to report within the week. It said the Northern Council's formal reception of the evidence was noted and useful. The 3rd line said, "In future correspondence, I will sign as Calum." She folded that letter carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her traveling coat. Petra, who had watched the letter arrive and be folded and pocketed with the expression of someone exercising considerable restraint, said, "Well?" Lyra said, "The investigation is proceeding." Petra said, "And?" Lyra said, "And things are moving in the right direction." Petra said, "Lyra." Lyra said, "What?" Petra said, "You have that face." Lyra said, "I don't have a face." Petra said, "You have the face you get when something has happened that you're not ready to talk about yet, but you're going to think about very carefully for an extended period before you do." Lyra said, "That's a very specific face." Petra said, "You've been making it since you were 7 years old." Lyra said, "The investigation is proceeding and things are in the right direction and I am going to take a walk." She took a long walk along the northern forest edge and she thought about 3 lines and a signature and the choice it represented. He had not needed to change the signature. The formal title would have been more appropriate for correspondence between the Alpha King and the daughter of a mid-rank southern noble. The change was small and deliberate and it said something. Not much. Enough. She walked until she had organized her thoughts into something workable, and then she walked back. Over the following week his reports came every 2 days. They were formal in structure, informational in content, but she began to read the specific way he wrote. The places where the official language thinned slightly and something more direct showed through. On the fourth day, he wrote that one of Lord Vane's former household staff had come forward voluntarily after hearing the investigation had opened, which suggested that people in the territory had been waiting for exactly this, someone with the authority to make it safe to speak. He wrote that the healer woman's account was being corroborated. He wrote these things in official language and then, at the end of the fourth day's letter, added one sentence that had nothing official about it. He wrote, "The window you came through has a new latch." She stared at that sentence for a long time. She wrote back at the end of that letter, in her own edition, after the official response, "I hope the new latch works better than the old one. It occurred to me later that I never asked if I interrupted something important." He replied the following morning. He wrote, "You interrupted nothing that mattered as much as what you brought with you." She held that letter and thought about the bond in her chest, and thought about wrong windows and right rooms, and the specific geography of how important things begin. She had been at Cressida's house for 3 weeks when her father arrived. She had expected him. She had expected him for at least a week, had known that once the formal suspension of the Vane arrangement reached him through official channels, and he had exhausted the political options available to him at the southern level, the next logical move was to come north himself. He arrived with 2 attendants, and the particular expression of a man who had been managing a situation that had stopped cooperating. Lord Brennan Ashfin was a compact, careful man in his 50s with gray at his temples, and the instinct for leverage that had kept his house in reasonable standing despite its mid-rank bloodline. He had never been cruel to Lyra. He had also never been someone who prioritized her well-being over his arrangements. She met him in Cressida's front room with the fire going and tea on the table, which Cressida had prepared and then absented herself from with the diplomatic efficiency of a woman who understood when a room needed to contain exactly 2 people. Her father sat across from her. He said, "This has gone far enough." She said, "I agree. I think it went far enough when the 3rd she-wolf in Lord Vane's household disappeared." He said, "Those are allegations." She said, "They are formally documented allegations now received into the Northern Council record and being investigated by the Crown." He looked at her. He said, "You went to the Alpha King." She said, "I presented evidence." He went to the Alpha King, which is a different thing. He said, "You understand what this costs our house." She said, "What it costs our house to not hand me to a man who in all probability killed his previous 3 mates." He said, "What it costs to have the Alpha King's investigation connected to our name." He said, "People will wonder why Brennan Ashvane's daughter was in a position to present evidence directly to the Crown. They'll ask questions." She said, "Let them ask." He said, "Lyra," she said, "I compiled that evidence for 2 months, Father, 2 months. I brought it to you, and you told me the alliance mattered more." She said, "I was not going to stand in a ceremony and be formally handed to someone I believe to be dangerous because the trade route through his territory is convenient for your interests." He looked at her for a long moment. She had learned long ago to read the layers of her father's silences. This one had calculation underneath it, rapid and pivoting. He said, "The investigation may clear him." She said, "It may." He said, "In which case the arrangement could theoretically resume." She said, "No." He looked at her. She said, "Even if the investigation finds nothing, which I don't believe it will, the answer is no." He said, "On what grounds?" She said, "On the grounds that I am 23 years old, and I have spent 2 months learning exactly what I'm capable of when I'm allowed to act, rather than be arranged." She said it without heat. He heard the steadiness in it, and she saw him recalibrate. He said, "You've changed since the solstice gathering." She said, "I've always been this." You weren't paying attention. He was quiet. He said, "The Alpha King's investigation. Is there anything else between you and the Crown I should know about?" She looked at her father. She thought about the letters in the inside pocket of her traveling coat. She said, The investigation is official and complete. There is nothing personal between me and the Crown. She said it as a true statement of where things currently stood. Her father studied her for another moment. He was a careful man. He knew the limits of what he could extract when she had decided not to give it. He said, "Your mother's sister has been a bad influence on your intractability." She said, "Aunt Cressida has been an excellent influence on my clarity." He made a sound that was not quite agreement. He stayed for dinner. Cressida returned for dinner and was gracious and pleasant and gave him no opening whatsoever to advance any of the angles Lyra could see him considering. After he left the following morning, Cressida sat across from Lyra with her tea and said, "He's going to let this go for now. He has no other option." Lyra said, "He'll try again later. Some other arrangement." Cressida said, "Perhaps you'll handle it the same way." She said, "You're different than when you arrived." Lyra said, "Am I?" Cressida said, "You arrived as someone who knew what she was running from. You're becoming someone who knows where she's going." She said, "The correspondence with the Crown is not nothing, Lyra." Lyra said, "It's careful." Cressida said, "Careful things can still become important." She said, "He writes to you every 2 days." Lyra said, "Those are official investigation updates." Cressida said, "And the unofficial portions?" Lyra looked at her aunt. She said, "How do you know there are unofficial portions?" Cressida said, "Because you have been putting letters in the inside pocket of your coat rather than your desk, and you are not someone who is careless about the distinction." Lyra said, "You notice too much." Cressida said, "It's why they put me on the council." She poured more tea. She said, "What is he like?" Lyra was quiet for a moment. She thought about how to answer honestly. She said, "Controlled, deliberately so." She said, "But there are places where the control thins and what's underneath it is something more genuine and considerably more interesting." She said, "He listened to 2 months of compiled evidence at 11 at night from a woman who had just climbed through his window, and he never once made her feel like an inconvenience." Cressida said, "That's not nothing." Lyra said, "No." She said, "It's not nothing." The investigation concluded on the 28th day. The official report reached the Northern Council the same morning it reached her by private letter. She read the private letter first. He wrote that Lord Vane's former household healer had provided detailed testimony regarding the second mate's final weeks, testimony that was unambiguous in its implications. He wrote that the third mate had been located alive in a remote property in the eastern edge of Vane's territory, confined there for 14 months, and had been retrieved and was now under Crown protection. He wrote that Lord Vane had been taken into custody the previous evening. He wrote these things formally and completely, and then at the end of the letter he wrote, "The third mate's name is Senna. She is 26 years old. She has been asking who brought this forward. I told her your name. She asked me to tell you that she is grateful." Lyra sat with that for a long time. Senna, 26 years old, 14 months confined in a remote property because she had been inconvenient and replaceable, and there had been no one to notice or look or ask the right questions until Lyra had spent 2 months making herself impossible to ignore. She had known, when she compiled the evidence, that it mattered. She had not let herself feel the full weight of it mattering, because feeling it fully while she was still compiling, still planning, still trying to get herself out of a ceremony and across a border, would have made her less useful. She let herself feel it now. She sat in the chair by Cressida's window and looked at the winter trees outside and felt the full weight of Senna, 26 years old, asking who had brought this forward. It moved through her in a long, slow wave. Then she wrote back. She wrote her official response to the investigation report, formal and complete. And then she wrote, "Tell Senna that she did the most important part. She survived long enough to be found. What I did was only paperwork." She paused. She wrote, "I would like to come back to Velmore, not as a petitioner or a formal visitor." She paused again. She wrote, I think we have things to discuss that letters are not adequate for. She sent it. She told Petra that evening. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're going back," Lyra said. "Yes," Petra said, "to the palace you barely escaped from 3 weeks ago." Lyra said, "The situation has changed somewhat since then." Petra said, "Because of the investigation, or because of the letters?" Lyra said, "Both." Petra looked at her. She said, "What do you want, Lyra? Not strategically. Not what's smart. What do you want?" Lyra thought about the bond in her chest, 3 weeks of it, steadier now than it had been the night she had dropped through the wrong window and looked up and found silver eyes already watching. She said, "I want to find out if what started in that study is what I think it is." She said, "I want to meet him in a room I was meant to be in this time." She said, "With all the information available and no immediate crisis requiring resolution." Petra said, "That sounds reasonable." Lyra said, "It is reasonable." Petra said, "Are you nervous?" Lyra said, "Considerably." Petra said, "Good." She said, "Last time you weren't nervous enough, and look how that turned out." She said it, with something warm behind it. Lyra said, "I fell through the right window by accident." Petra said, "The best things usually start like that." The reply from Velmore came the following morning. He wrote that Senna had read her message and had wept, which he reported with the particular directness of a man who understood that this information mattered and was not going to pretend otherwise. He wrote that the formal proceedings against Lord Vane were established and would proceed without requiring her further presence or testimony. He wrote, officially, that she was welcome to return to Velmore at her convenience as a guest of the Crown. And then he wrote, "I know a route through the palace that does not require climbing. Though I should tell you that the window with the new latch is in a room you would be welcome in regardless." She read that last line 3 times. She thought about welcome and regardless, and the particular weight of words chosen by someone who was being careful, and also, underneath the careful, honest. She wrote back, "I'll arrive in 4 days." She did not add anything else. She thought it was enough. She arrived in 4 days, as she had said. Petra rode with her as far as the southern border of Velmore and then turned back because she had her own life to return to, and because, she said, some rooms only need 2 people in them. Lyra rode the last day alone. The palace of Velmore came into view in the late afternoon, the same greystone towers against the same pale sky, different from the night she had first seen it, because that night she had been arriving as someone else's arrangement, and now she was arriving as herself. A guard met her at the gate. He was expecting her, which meant the arrival had been prepared for, which meant she had been thought about before she appeared. Small things. She was building a picture from small things, and she was building it carefully. She was shown to guest chambers that were warm and properly prepared, flowers on the table, a fire already lit, the particular atmosphere of a room someone had considered rather than simply opened. She changed from traveling clothes and washed and sat for a moment in the quiet of the room and talked to herself honestly. She was nervous. She was also clear. Those 2 things could coexist. A servant came to tell her the king would receive her in his study when she was ready. She noted the word receive, not summon. Receive, when she was ready. She went when she was ready. The study was the same. Fire, maps, books, the ordered chaos of a room in genuine use. He was standing at the desk and looked up when she entered, and the bond moved between them the same way it had moved the night she had dropped through the window, immediate and unmistakable and entirely certain. He looked different than she had allowed herself to remember him. Less of an abstraction, more specific. The particular way he held himself, the silver blonde hair, less disordered than the last time, the pale silver eyes that were giving away more than they had 3 weeks ago, which she suspected was a deliberate choice. He said, "You came." She said, "I said I would." He said, People say many things. She said, I say what I mean. He looked at her for a moment. He said, I know. He said it the way someone says a thing they have been observing carefully from a distance and have decided to stop hedging about. He said, sit down. She said, you said that last time. He said, last time you were standing in my study, having climbed through my window at midnight. She said, and this time? He said, this time you're here because you chose to be. He said, sit down if you'd like to. The difference in it was significant, and he had made it deliberately, and she appreciated it precisely. She sat. He sat across from her. The fire between them, the maps on the desk, the same room but with different weight in it. She said, tell me about Senna. He told her. Senna was recovering. She had a sister in the Western Territory who had been trying to find her for 14 months and had been told repeatedly that she was unwell and not receiving visitors. The sister had arrived 2 days after the rescue with an expression, he said, that he did not have adequate language for. Senna was physically well, considering the confinement had not been violent in the conventional sense. It had been isolation, which he said with a flatness that told her he understood exactly what prolonged isolation cost. She said, will she testify? He said, she wants to. He said, she is one of the strongest people I have met in recent memory. Lyra said, she survived 14 months on the belief that someone would eventually look. He said, yes, they were quiet for a moment. She said, what happens to Lord Vane? He said, a full trial before the Pack Council. He said, it will not be a comfortable process for anyone, but it will be a complete one. She said, good. He said, your evidence made it possible. She said, my evidence started it. You made it possible. He said, we did. She heard the we and chose to let it sit for a moment before responding. She said, why did you agree to pursue it that night? He said, I told you. 3 she-wolves. She said, yes, but you had been watching the territory for 6 months and not acted. She said, something changed your decision that night. He said, you came through my window with 2 months of compiled evidence and the specific unflinching quality of someone who has been doing the right thing with no institutional support for as long as they could manage and was running out of options. He said, that changed my decision. She said, that's not the only thing that changed it. He was quiet. She said, I'm not asking you to say it. I'm asking you to not pretend it wasn't part of it. He held her gaze. He said, no, it wasn't the only thing. He said, you know what the other thing was. She said, yes, she said, I want to know how you've been sitting with it. The question was more direct than most people would have asked a king. She was not most people, and he was beginning to know that. He said, carefully, he said, for the first week I told myself it was the bond doing what bonds do, creating urgency and significance around something that was strategically inconvenient. She said, and the second week? He said, the second week your letters were making that explanation increasingly difficult to maintain. She said, why? He said, because you write the way you talk. He said, directly, without performance. He said, I have had a great deal of correspondence in 15 years as king, and none of it has felt like talking to someone rather than managing an exchange. She said, is that good or inconvenient? He said, both. She heard the echo of what she had said about brave and foolish, and she thought he had remembered it too. She said, what do you want, Kellum? The name, direct and without preamble, made something shift in his expression. He said, I want to stop treating the bond as a complication to be managed. He said, I want to find out what it is when neither of us is in a crisis or a corridor or conducting official correspondence. He said, I want to do that honestly and without rushing it because you deserve something that has been considered, not something that has been reactive. She looked at him, across the fire. She said, that's a very careful answer. He said, yes. She said, Is it what you actually want, or is it what you think is correct to want? He looked at her. He said, both. She said, those can be the same thing. He said, I'm learning that. She said, all right. She said, then let's find out. They spent the following 2 weeks in the particular careful way of people who have decided to be honest with each other and are discovering what that requires. He showed her the palace properly this time, not through servants' corridors by candlelight, but in the daylight hours, the council chambers and the records rooms and the great hall that she had been in on the night of the solstice gathering, which looked entirely different in the day. Smaller and more human, and less like a stage set for other people's arrangements. She paid attention to how the palace responded to him, the staff who moved around him with the ease of people who had not been given reason to fear, the guards who met his eye directly rather than looking away, the senior advisors who disagreed with him in council meetings, which she sat in on twice at his invitation, and were not punished for disagreeing. She was building a picture, and the picture had a particular quality she was being careful not to overinterpret, but also not to dismiss. He paid attention to her, too. She noticed him noticing. The way he tracked how she moved through rooms, what she looked at, how she talked to people. Not surveillance, something more like interest, the particular interest of a person trying to understand someone they have already decided matters. She went to see Senna on the 4th day. He offered to come, and she said, no, this should be just us. He said, all right. Senna was installed in comfortable rooms in the palace's southern wing with her sister, who had a protective quality that Lyra respected immediately. Senna was a slight woman with dark eyes, and the particular stillness of someone who had learned to conserve themselves, and had not yet fully unlearned it. They sat together in the small sitting room, and the sister made tea and then found somewhere else to be, the same diplomatic efficiency Cressida had shown. And Lyra and Senna sat with their cups, and Lyra said simply, I'm glad you're here. Senna said, I asked the king to tell me about you. She said, before you came back. He told me about the evidence and how you compiled it. She said, I wanted to understand who had been paying attention when everyone else wasn't. Lyra said, I almost didn't compile it in time. I almost convinced myself it wasn't enough to act on. Senna said, what changed your mind? Lyra said, a specific account from a healer woman who attended you in your final weeks before the confinement. Senna was quiet for a moment. She said, Mira. Lyra said, yes. Senna said, I thought she might. She said, she was the only one who seemed to understand that what was happening wasn't right. She said I hoped she would find a way to tell someone. Lyra said, she found me. They sat with that for a moment. Then Senna said, the king. She said, he's different since you came back. Lyra said, different how? Senna said, less alone. She said it simply, without elaboration. Lyra held it. She did not know yet what to do with the image of him as someone who was less alone when she was present. She stored it carefully. On the 7th day he took her riding, just the two of them, which she suspected was unusual for him based on the particular way his guard captain had received the instruction. They rode east through the territory into rougher country than the palace grounds, open rocky land under a pale winter sky. She had been riding since childhood, and he matched her pace rather than pulling ahead, which she noticed. They rode in easy silence for a while, the kind of silence that had been developing between them, comfortable and full rather than empty. He said, tell me about your childhood. She said, that's broad. He said, start wherever you want. She told him. The Southern Territory house with its small garden. Her mother, who had been a gentle woman with strong opinions about plant medicine. Her father's careful management of everything, including his daughter. The years of watching other she-wolves find their bonds while she waited, without knowing what she was waiting for. She said, I became very good at useful things while I was waiting. He said, is that what the evidence was? She said the evidence was necessary. He said, yes, but it was also what you do with time that isn't being what other people want it to be. She looked at him. She said, "That's an accurate observation." He said, "I've had practice with the same thing." She said, "Tell me." He told her. He told her about 15 years of kingship that had begun at 16 when his father died and had required him to become something specific and reliable before he had finished becoming himself. About learning to be the thing the territory needed and finding, periodically, places where the thing the territory needed and the thing he was were not the same, and having to decide quietly which one took precedence. She said, "Which one usually won?" He said, "The territory." He paused. He said, "I'm beginning to think that was not always the right calculation." She said, "What changed the calculation?" He looked at her across the winter landscape. He said, "You came through my window with evidence and a plan and the specific quality of someone who had never been given a proper room and had made something remarkable in the absence of one." He said, "I found I was less interested in what the territory needed and more interested in what it would mean to know you properly." She held that. She said, "That's the most personal thing you've said to me." He said, "I'm aware." She said, "Are you comfortable with that?" He said, "No." She said, "But you said it anyway." He said, "Yes." She thought that was possibly the most important thing she had learned about him so far. They rode back in the low afternoon light with the bond between them warm and undefended on both sides for the first time. On the 10th day, Lord Brennan Ashvane sent a formal letter to the palace. She was not surprised. She had been expecting her father to find his next approach, and this was it. The letter requested an audience with the Alpha King to discuss, as her father put it, the resolution of the Ashvane-Vane arrangement and the appropriate future positioning of his daughter in light of recent events. The recent events being, of course, the investigation and the Crown connection that her father had spent 3 weeks deciding how to turn to his advantage. She read it when Calum brought it to her, which he did directly, handing it across the study desk and watching her face as she read it. She set it down. She said, "He wants to formalize something." He said, "Yes." She said, "He sees the Crown connection as a new arrangement to be leveraged instead of the old one." He said, "That's my read." She said, "What did you tell him?" He said, "Nothing, yet. I wanted to ask you first." She looked at him. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you are not an arrangement, and I am not going to respond to your father as if you are without talking to you first." She held that carefully. She said, "If you receive him, he'll use whatever happens in that meeting as leverage." He said, "I know." She said, "And if you decline to receive him, he'll escalate politically and make noise about the Crown interfering in a valid, noble arrangement." He said, "Yes," she said, "neither option is clean." He said, "No." She said, "What do you want to do?" He said, "I want to receive him." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I want to look at the man who had your evidence in his hands and chose the trade route." He said, "I want him to understand the difference between an arrangement and a person." She said, "He's my father." He said, "I know." He said, "I will be respectful." He said, and clear. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "All right." She said, "I want to be there." He said, "He'll use your presence as confirmation of the arrangement he's constructing in his head." She said, "Let him think that." He said, "You have something in mind." She said, "I want him to hear it from me directly, not from official correspondence. Not from a formal position. From me." He studied her. He said, "What do you want to say to him?" She said, "That I am not a position to be arranged. That I have spent 3 weeks in this palace because I chose to be here, not because I was placed here," she said, "and that whatever happens between me and this crown will be decided by me and him together, not by my father's trade calculations." Something moved through Calum's expression. He said quietly, "Together," she said, "if that's what it is." "Yes," he said, "it's what it is." She said, Then he should hear that from both of us. Lord Brennan Ashvane arrived 3 days later. He came with 2 advisors and the particular well-prepared energy of a man who had spent 3 days constructing his strategy. He was received in the formal council chamber, which Kellum had chosen deliberately, a room with appropriate gravity and no domestic warmth. Lyra sat at the table beside Calum, which she saw her father register with a rapid recalibration behind his eyes. He had expected her to be present as a topic, not as a participant. He sat across from them with his advisors and opened with the political framing she had anticipated. The Ashvane house's long loyalty to the Velmore crown, the unfortunate situation with Lord Vane, which he acknowledged graciously, as if he had been on the right side of it all along. The question of his daughter's position now that the previous arrangement had been dissolved. He had gotten perhaps 3 sentences into the 3rd point when Lyra said, "Father," he stopped. She said, "I want to say something before we go further." He looked at her. She said, "You arranged me to Lord Vane because the southern trade route mattered more than the evidence I brought you." She said it, without heat. He said, "That is a simplification." She said, "It is accurate." She said, "I am not here because I was arranged here. I am here because I spent 2 months doing something that mattered, and it brought me to a room where I met someone I chose to know." She said, "I understand that you want to formalize whatever you perceive as an arrangement between me and the crown. I want you to understand that what happens between me and Calum is not yours to formalize." He looked between them. He said, "Lyra, the political realities," she said, "are not more important than me." She said, "I learned that by having to teach myself. I would prefer not to have to keep relearning it." Her father was quiet for a long moment. She watched the calculation behind his eyes. She watched it run its course and find no available leverage. She watched him accept the landscape. He said, finally, to Calum, "She has always been like this." Calum said, "I know," he said. "It's one of the most significant things about her." Her father looked at him. Something shifted in his expression that was not political calculation, something more like a man reassessing something he had consistently undervalued. He said, "She gets it from her mother." She said, "I know." They concluded the meeting without a formal arrangement of any kind. Her father left the following morning. He said goodbye to her at the gate with his advisors at a distance, and he looked at her for a moment with something she had not seen from him before. Not approval exactly, something quieter. Recognition, he said, "You're going to be all right." She said, "I was always going to be all right." He said, "I should have known that earlier." She said, "Yes." She watched him ride away. Calum stood beside her. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "Yes." She said, "He's not a bad man." He said, "No." She said, "He just valued the wrong things." He said, "People can learn to value differently." She said, "Sometimes." She turned back toward the palace. She said, "I want to walk in the gardens." He said, "It's cold." She said, "I know." He said, "All right." He walked with her. The formal announcement was made on the winter solstice, which Calum said was traditional for significant declarations in the Velmore bloodline, and which Lyra noted with the private amusement of someone who had counted wrong windows and arrived at exactly the right place. The announcement was made in the great hall with the full pack council in attendance, and the senior nobles of all 4 territories represented either in person or by letter. It declared the formal recognition of the mate bond between Alpha King Calum Vex of Velmore and Lyra Ashvane, daughter of the Southern Territories, and her installation as Queen Consort of Velmore. She stood beside him in the great hall and thought about the last time she had been in this room, invisible against the far wall, carrying a tray, watching the doors open and the world stop. She thought about what had changed and what had not. The bond had not changed. It had been what it was from the first moment, and had remained what it was through 3 weeks of careful correspondence, and 2 weeks of study conversations and cold morning rides and a meeting with her father and Senna's quiet voice saying, "He's less alone." What had changed was the space around the bond, the room that had been built for it, the honest room with its particular furniture, evidence compiled, corridors shared, letters signed with first names, a window with a new latch that had been mentioned 3 times and now had the weight of a private language. After the announcement, after the formal proceedings had concluded and the hall had done what halls do at significant moments, with the particular orchestrated noise of institutional acknowledgement, he brought her out of the main press of people to a quieter corridor. Not the private one by candlelight. A regular corridor, wide and lit, part of the palace that was going to be hers. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "Yes." She said, "It's real now." He said, "It was real before." She said, "I know. But now the hall knows." He said, "Does that change something?" She thought about it. She said, "It makes it harder to be casual about." He said, "Were you being casual?" She said, "No. I was being careful." He said, "There's a difference." She said, "Yes, the difference is that careful ends and casual is a habit." She said, "I've stopped being careful in the way that keeps things at a distance." He said, "When did that happen?" She thought about the ride through the Eastern Territory in the pale winter light when he had said, "You came through my window with evidence and a plan," and she had felt the full weight of being seen accurately. She said, "On the 8th day." He said, "I think it was earlier for me." She said, "When?" He said, "The letter where you told me the window latch." He said, "I wrote back about the new latch because I wanted an excuse to keep the correspondence going, and I realized I didn't need an excuse, that the wanting was sufficient, and that was new." She said, "That's a very specific moment." He said, "I have been specific about you from the beginning." She said, "I know." She said, "It terrified me a little." He said, "Good." She looked at him. She said, "Good?" He said, "It terrified me considerably." He said, "I prefer that we were both terrified." She said, "Equal terms." He said, "Yes." She thought about equal terms and the study desk and the council chamber and the ride and the correspondence and the garden in the cold and all the specific accumulated weight of 2 people being honest with each other in a room neither of them had been in before. She said, "I want to go back to the Eastern settlements." Not as an inspection. She said, "I know those communities. They trusted me before I was anything official. I don't want to lose that because of a title." He said, "You won't lose it." She said, "I might if I'm not careful about how I return." He said, "Then we'll be careful about how you return." She said, "Both of us?" He said, "If you'll have me come." She said, "Sometimes." He said, "I'll take sometimes." She said, "There's something else." He waited. She said, "Senna." He said, "What about her?" She said, "She has nowhere to return to that is safe. Her sister's territory is too close to Vane's reach, even with the trial pending." He said, "What are you thinking?" She said, "There are positions in the Queen's household, real positions, with real purpose." She said, "Senna is one of the strongest people I have met in recent memory. I would like her nearby if she's willing." He looked at her. He said, "Done." She said, "You agreed to that very quickly." He said, "You looked at a woman who survived 14 months in isolation and saw capability rather than damage." He said, "I'm not going to question that judgment." She looked up at him in the corridor of her palace on the night of her formal announcement and thought about all the ways beginnings look like accidents until they don't. She said, "There's one more thing." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I want to see the window." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Now?" She said, "I want to see it with the new latch." She said, "I want to see the room I actually ended up in when I was trying to get somewhere else." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Come with me." He led her through the palace she was already learning, through corridors she was beginning to know, upstairs she had not yet taken, to a door she recognized. He opened it. The study was the same. Fire, maps, books, the ordered beautiful chaos of a room in constant use. She walked to the window. She looked at the new latch, solid and sure. She looked out at the palace grounds below, the moonlight on old stone, the same view it had been 3 weeks ago when she had been outside it, and everything had been about to change. She turned back to the room, to the desk with its maps, to him, standing in the doorway watching her with the particular quality of attention she had been learning to recognize as his version of everything. She said, "It's a good room." He said, "It's yours too now." She said, "I know." She said it without strategy and without careful and without the particular containment she had spent years maintaining. She said, "I counted the wrong windows." He said, "Yes," she said, "I'm glad." He said, "So am I." She crossed the room. He met her halfway. The bond between them settled into something that was no longer reaching or aching or being held at careful distance. It simply was. Complete and certain and real. Outside the window, the Palace of Velmore went on in the winter night, and somewhere in the Eastern Territories, the land that had been held and known and cared for was held and known and cared for still. And in the study, with the new latch and the maps and the fire, 2 people who had found each other through one wrong window and one right room stood in the space of what they had built together and let it be exactly what it was. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it and would like to support the channel, the link is in the description below. Leave me a comment. I read every single one, and they mean more than you know.